Hi, everyone. My name is Seth. I actually have a whole slide to introduce myself later. So you're here to learn about automating AWS disaster recovery and specifically how you can do that with AWS tools and how you can do that with RPO. Oh, I'm being informed that we actually didn't open the chat, so we asked you to introduce yourselves, but you don't have a way to do that. But you do have a way to ask questions, so questions are in the Q&A box. So anyway, let's talk about disaster recovery. Let's talk about RPO. I am the principal resilience architect here at RPO, and a little more about me. So as the principal resilience architect, I'm working with customers on their disaster recovery and the resilience challenges. But prior to that, I was with AWS. So I was actually with Amazon for about 14 years. I joined Amazon back in 2005 when it was a much smaller company, but AWS for about 5 of those years. And I was the global reliability lead. And there I was working with hundreds of customers on their resilience challenges, on disaster recovery. If you just Google for disaster recovery on AWS, you'll probably find a document I wrote or a presentation I gave because that was really an area of interest for me. And I loved working with customers there on that. And I'm really happy to be here with you today to share with you what I know and share about disaster recovery with you here today. All right. So I'm going to start with the basics and work our way up. But before I take it to that level, I wanted to sort of deep dive on RPO because you're here learning about disaster recovery. This webinar is being brought to you by RPO. So I just want to tee it up with what RPO actually is doing. And RPO is the ability to stand up a complete copy of your workload in a recovery environment. And if you don't understand what some of those terms mean, we're definitely going to get into that. But just to put a fine point on it, you're running a workload in AWS and something happens, the big red X, we're going to bring up an entire copy of that workload in a different region, in a different account. And this is not backup software. Backup's about data, and that's important and critical part of your workload. But we're going to not only back up and restore your data, but back up and restore your infrastructure, your networking, your security principles, and your configuration. And that configuration could be the part, IAM policies, resource policies, environment variables. And the cool thing about that is RPO is not just going to copy and paste those, but it's going to intelligently translate those. That's hence you get the magic wand there. So that we're bringing up a fully functional workload, a copy of your workload in a recovery environment. And that's what RPO is doing for you. But to back it up a bit, let's go back to basics. A lot of you might know this, but I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Let's talk about cloud resilience and do a brief overview of what that is. So what is resilience, right? There's a definition of resilience, right? The ability to recover from faults or load spikes and remain operational. But I like to make it really straightforward. I mean, resilience is about don't let the bad stuff bring you down. It's a mess out there in the real world. Whether you're in a data center or in the cloud, it's a complicated, chaotic, swirling mass of chaos, right? And things happen all the time. Anybody who's running production software knows that. Now, how do you keep your workloads, your business applications from going down and staying available despite that mess? And that's really what resilience is about. And that's how we want to get to that happy bucket we have there. And when I was back in AWS, I helped come up with this mental model, three-part mental model of what resilience is. So resilience, the three parts of the model, one is high availability. High availability is about recovering in place. Think about a dead hard drive or replacing a server or a very brief network spike, and you need to go to a different network, different availability zone. This is things you could do within a given location, within an AWS region, and be back up and running. High availability is the nines. When you think about 4 nines, 5 nines, that's high availability. Disaster recovery is another piece of the puzzle. Disaster recovery requires that you have high availability, but disaster recovery is about the bigger, less frequent types of events, and we'll talk about those events look like, that could impact your workload. These are events of such scope and magnitude that they require you to recover in another location, in another AWS region. And disaster recovery is the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. The third part, also important, is continuous improvement, chaos engineering, observability, et cetera. But we're going to focus on disaster recovery today. So let's talk about disaster recovery. So as I said, big, less frequent events. And here's the three categories I like to talk about: natural disasters, technical failures, including bad software deployments by your cloud provider, and human actions, including both the benign accidents and the less benign, the malign malware, ransomware type effects. And disaster recovery is about your business continuity. As I said, I already said multiple times, focuses on those larger scale, less frequent events. And unlike high availability, which is measured in terms of the nines, we think about disaster recovery in terms of each event. The events are so infrequent, we kind of think about them on a per event basis, but they're not so infrequent that you shouldn't worry about it. You still need to worry about it. But when they happen, we're worrying about like, what is our recovery time? How fast do we come back up? What is our recovery point? How much data do we lose? That's disaster recovery. And for those disaster recovery, we come up with disaster recovery objectives, RPO and RTO. So you see a timeline here, and along that timeline, boom, there's a big flame, there's a disaster. Let's talk about RTO, or recovery time objective first, the one on the right. That's the one people really have an easy time wrapping their minds around. So a disaster happens, and now you're down, and then you come back up because you have disaster recovery. That's your recovery time. So the recovery time objective is the maximum time that you can be down. You can be down longer, no longer than that. You need a disaster recovery strategy that brings you back within that time frame. Recovery time objective. Recovery point objective is a little harder for people to wrap their heads around, but it's about data loss. And you can see on the timeline here, there's a big dot on when I took my last backup. Then some time passes and there's a failure. So that's my recovery point. Basically, I've lost any data that happened between that recovery point, between that backup and the disaster. So my recovery point objective measured in time is the maximum amount of time between my last good recovery point and my disaster. It's a measure of data loss. And hopefully you figured out by now the name of our company, RPO, is basically based on RPO. So now you know why we have that name. So in terms of the design for disaster recovery, you need to have the ability to recover in another location. And when we're talking about AWS, we're going to be thinking about recovering in another AWS region. You're going to have to back up your data there. You're going to have to automate your ability to bring up your infrastructure, bring up your security principles, bring up your networking there. And you want to prevent drift between those sites. So it looks like this. You can see that we're operating our workload out of US East 1. US West 2, another region, has backups. It has these grayed out instances there, meaning that they're not running, but I have the ability to run them. And so I actually can then, if a bad thing happens, and this would be a technical failure, let's say that in US East 1, there's an outage in the Kinesis service or the Lambda service, and you can't run your workload there. Then what we're going to do is bring up our compute, restore our data from backups in that recovery region, and route our customers there, and we're back up and running. So remember, I shared with you these three types of disasters, and those are actually accurate, great categorizations of the type of disasters you're going to see that you need to protect yourself against. But in working with hundreds, maybe thousands of customers at AWS and RPO, I've found that there's actually two subcategories of disasters that are the most common. So these are the ones I wanted to surface for you as the ones that really happen in real life and that you really, you need to be concerned about all of it, but these are the ones that really we see happen. And the first one is, I mentioned, sort of alluded to it earlier, an AWS regional event. Now, sometimes people say a region is down, and that's never happened. An AWS region, I don't, as far as I know, any cloud provider has never had a region hard down. Now, that could happen if a meteor strikes the earth in the right place, but not likely. What's more likely is that there's been a bad deployment by the cloud provider. There's been some network glitch, or some major structural damage to the region, the data centers in that region, that's causing it that there's something going on. A service is down, a service is overall degraded, and that means you can't run your workload there. And this happens. It's not frequent, but it happens. And in that case, you're going to need to fail over cross region, and RPO enables that. So from US East 1 to US West 2, or whatever two regions you want to fail from to, this is important. Um, and I see someone mentioning technical issue has made US East go down. All right, maybe it's a semantics issue, but no, it didn't go down. I mean, I could point to the 2000 event where Kinesis went down, but because Kinesis went down, also Event Bridge and CloudWatch were down, which means what I said, you can't run your software there. There was somebody there sitting, fat and happy on their static EC2 server. They could still be running in US East 1 on that day. So wasn't available. The whole region That's not true. There's no time that an entire region was not available. What happened is regions get degraded and you can't run your workload there. And that's the important part, is that you can't run your workload there. So you need to fail over cross region. Now, the other thing that we tend to see is ransomware and malware. It's on the rise, actually, with a 21-day average recovery. Ransom and malware is something you want to be protected against. And RPO provides the ability to fail over cross account. Why is this important? Because if you're attacked by malware or ransomware, that means the attackers have gained access to your primary account. They have your credentials. They did their bad stuff. If you're going to be able to recover, you need to recover in a bunker account or a clean room environment, where is an account with different credentials. You can see the keys are different colors that the attacker doesn't have access to, and bring everything back up. RPO enables both cross-region, cross-account. You could do either or both with RPO. All right, so now time for audience participation. Poll question: how would you describe your cross-region and or cross-account disaster recovery strategy for your AWS workloads? And you can see there's your choice. Go ahead and we'll take a few minutes for folks to answer that while I take a sip of coffee. Actually, I can answer questions while you're doing the poll. And maybe that's not a good idea, right? Because you're concentrating on the poll. Concentrate on the read the poll. All right. And Washington, who's helping me with the poll, will tell me when he thinks the poll is done, and we'll share the results and we'll talk about them a bit.
I think we're waiting on a few more people. We're at 17 right now, so I'll give them another 20 or so seconds to get in there.
Yeah, I think that sounds reasonable. All right, I'll answer some questions. Can you compare to DRS as well? Will do, coming up. Is DR performed manually or by automation process or AI? Well, AI is an interesting one, but what I suggest is that your DR be highly automated but human initiated, meaning that it's not, the automation doesn't choose when to fail over, a human chooses, but once a human makes that choice, it's a simple push of a button and the whole thing's automated. All right, I think we show the poll results. Let's go see what they look like. I'm really curious. All right, so does the audience see this, Washington, or just me?
I think everyone should be able to see it.
All right, just in case, we don't have a strategy in place at 35%. We have a strategy, but we're unsure it'll work at 29%. Okay, so that's 64% of people without good DR. And we have a strategy in place and we test it once a year is 35%. We have a strategy in place and test it multiple times per year, 0%. All right, by the end of this talk, you will then have a path towards being able to have a strategy in place and test it multiple times per year. So we're going to go from 0 to some number greater than 0. 64% of you are don't have a DR strategy that you're sure of. And that's scary, right? I mean, again, we never want to talk about fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I'm not trying to strike fear into anybody's heart. It's about your business needs. If you have business continuity needs, requirements to be available a certain amount of time for your customers, whether you're in finance or you're in healthcare or you're just a consumer product that wants to maintain a good reputation for your customers, you need to be thinking about disaster recovery, and that's what we're talking about today. All right. Just by coincidence, let's talk about how to implement a DR strategy, a disaster recovery strategy. Let's talk about maybe implementing one that you actually like and one you could test and be sure of. And to do this, you first have to understand that resilience in AWS is a shared responsibility, the shared responsibility model for resilience. And I helped create this model, and you could find it in several locations. It's in the disaster recovery white paper. You could find it, that link there. The QR code is right there for you. Shared responsibility between whom? Between AWS and you, the customer. AWS's side of this responsibility is to provide you with the tools you need to do disaster recovery. They provide you with automation tooling. This means like infrastructure as code, SDK, things you could do to stand things up automatically. Event bridge, things like that. AWS provides you with a concept of AWS regions. I've been talking about regions, but I didn't define them. A region is a place in the world where AWS has multiple data centers in that region that hosts their services they serve to you. And what's really nice about regions from a failure point of view, from a fault tolerance point of view, is that they're very strong fault isolation boundaries between regions. What does that mean? It means you're very highly unlikely to have a correlated failure between regions. What does that mean? If there's a failure in a region, it's highly unlikely that it's going to impact another region. And this is why we keep talking about that cross-regional recovery. So AWS provides the regional construct. They've done that. They maintain the servers there, the infrastructure there. They're doing a great job. AWS provides you with data backup capabilities, the ability to back up your RDS, your DynamoDB, et cetera. AWS provides you with strong security. So it's an important part of that malware strategy. We could stand things up in that safe room environment. What's your responsibility? Number one, AWS Well Architected. If you're not familiar with AWS Well Architected, this is a list of the best practices that you should be using for your workloads in the cloud. And we're going to deep dive on this. In other words, you need to apply the best practices. Number two, you need to build it, right? So AWS provided you with tools. They provide you with everything I'm showing in that layer down there and more. Now it's up to you to put the Lego bricks together. So AWS Well Architected is divided into pillars. There are 6 pillars, one of which is the reliability pillar. I used to lead that pillar. I was the global lead for reliability. And in there is a bunch of best practices. And here are the best practices, not all of them, but a list of the primary best practices about disaster recovery. And you can see I've circled one of them. BP01 is define recovery objectives for downtime and data loss. Well, I've already covered that. That's RPO and RTO. You need to define your RPO and your RTO for every workload. Then use those defined objectives to define a recovery strategy. What do we mean by recovery strategy? These are the 4 recovery strategies that we define for disaster recovery. Backup and restore on the far left is easy and relatively cheap, but has longer RTOs and longer RPOs, which means more downtime, more data loss. Sounds bad, but that might be a legitimate strategy for less critical workloads. All the way to the far right, multi-site active-active is the highest cost, the highest complexity, but the lowest RTO and RPO. It's a trade-off. Where does RPO, our ARPIO, fit here? RPO is a pilot light strategy. So we're going to be saving you money off the bat, right? So we're not going to stand everything up that you need right away. We're going to stand it up when you need it. That saves money. However, RPO has some advantages. It has the ease of implementation of a backup and restore strategy. AWS Backup is a great product. You basically create a vault, you define what you want to back up, you push a button, it's backed up. RPO is just as easy. You define what workloads you want to restore, you want to protect, you push a button, it's that easy. While RPO has the recovery speed of a warm standby. How can we do that? Well, we're doing that with extensive, comprehensive automation and parallelization of that automation. So that's where we fit on this sort of spectrum of strategies. Going back to well architected, now automate your recovery. Let's do it, right? Somebody asked before, like, do you want to automate your recovery? Yes, we do. And to do that, let me take a step back and not talk about RPO. Let me talk about a time before I worked for RPO. Back in 2021, I wrote this blog post, and there's the link for it right there. You can scan the QR code. Again, I think we're going to share a PDF of the slides also afterwards. And in that blog post, I talked about how to automate your disaster recovery. And I had an example. I had an EBS volume, which is block storage, and an EC2 instance. And with these 2 resources, I showed you could restore the EBS volume by backing it up and restoring it with AWS Backup. Awesome product, by the way. You could stand up your EC2 instance using infrastructure as code, using AWS CloudFormation. And now you have stood up an EBS volume and an EC2 instance. But guess what? You haven't stood up a workload. You've stood up 2 resources, and they don't even know each other exist. Let's say you need to mount that EBS volume on that EC2 instance. Well, I shared how to do that too. I said, you do it this way. You set up an event bridge listener that listens to the event when the EBS volume has been restored. It then passes that information about that event onto a Lambda function, maybe a step function instead, that then listens for that event and extracts the tag information from that event, then goes and looks to see, is there an EC2 instance that has been stood up by CloudFormation with that matching tag, and then it runs automation code to mount it, and you're good to go, right? And this is, a valid way to do it. And you notice I put the little bricks in the corner. This is you putting the Lego bricks together. Perfectly valid way to do it yourself. But that was just 2 resource types, EBS volumes and EC2 instances. Let's say you have 45 different resource types, and these are all the resource types that are at one of our customers' choice hotels. Choice Hotels uses 45 different resource types. Remember, those are the classes of resource. The actual instantiations of them, they had 14,000 resources. So like hundreds of EBS volumes, hundreds of EC2 instances, et cetera, et cetera. So 14,000 total resources across 45 different resource types, across 20 plus AWS accounts. The do-it-yourself path was starting to look kind of onerous. They estimated it would take 8 engineers 2 years to do it. And this is where RPO comes in. With RPO, you could do it instead, that kind of onboarding inside of a month. And this is the result. Before RPO, they estimated it would take about a week for all their systems to respond, to be restored given a disaster. After using RPO, they met their goal of under 12 hours, with most systems recovering in under just a few hours. So RPO is bringing up things in under a few hours, and then they had some other unrelated related stuff that they had to do that maybe made some of them take 12 hours, but under several hours. So this is what we're looking for with a disaster recovery strategy that you would love, right? We're looking for the comprehensive automation, the push button recovery, and the fast recovery with low data loss. And RPO is built for AWS on AWS. We're AWS native product. We're running in the cloud. We're running on AWS. We're all serverless, but we're also built for your AWS workload. And again, talking about putting together Lego bricks, RPO is not competing with any AWS product. On the contrary, AWS Backup and Elastic Disaster Recovery, someone asked about DRS before, are used by RPO. RPO is literally orchestrating and leveraging these products to back up your data and move it cross-region and cross-account for you. RPO is using all of the building bricks there. It's creating AMIs, it's creating RDS snapshots, it's using S3 replication, it's using Aurora Global Database, it's using DynamoDB streaming, it's using all the AWS tools at our disposal to move that data from your primary environment into your recovery environment, all AWS. But we're not stopping at just the data. RPO also backs up and restores your entire infrastructure. You get an entire working workload. And we're doing that with all AWS tooling there. We're using Boto 3. If you're not familiar with that, that's the Python SDK. We're able to understand deeply what your workload looks like, how it's configured, and grab that data and move it into your recovery environment. And the other important thing about RPO is that we're never looking at your data. We never see your data. We're literally moving it from your primary to your recovery environment. Our SaaS software never sees your data, never touches your data, never exfiltrates your data. It's simply not allowed using the IAM policies we put in place. And RPO is also doing ransomware and malware recovery. And we'll talk in more detail about how it's doing that later. But it's, again, using AWS tooling for that. It's using GuardDuty to scan for malware. It's using network firewall and security groups to create quarantines to bring up a safe recovery in the event of a ransomware or malware attack. And so this is where I want to get a little deeper into architecture. So like if you're really into architecture, now is a chance to pay attention. If you're not into architecture, just bear with me for a minute. So this is an example of a Choice Hotel architecture for their booking software, the software you actually use when you go to their site to book a hotel room on the left. And you can see it's using EKS, it's using DynamoDB, it's using Secrets Manager, it's using ECR for their to host their containers. And on the right, you can see what's created by RPO. RPO, as I said, is creating recovery artifacts in their recovery environment without us ever seeing them, just putting them in place in their account. So Choice owns both of these accounts. These are two different accounts in two different regions. Choice owns both of them, and we're standing up, you can see, using AWS Backup, using DynamoDB streams. The entire VPC is being stood up ahead of time because VPCs don't cost anything. So as part of a good pilot light strategy, we could stand up a VPC for you ahead of time. We're using S3 replication. We set up an S3 bucket, and in the S3 bucket, we're putting your Lambda function code, your Kubernetes manifest. We're putting your secret manager secrets encrypted with KMS into that bucket. So it's all there and ready. So in the case of either a test or an actual disaster, they push the button and up comes their entire functional stack in a new account in a new region. The question is, are these services running in the customer environment? So the question is, so we are SaaS software. The Customer services are running in their environment. We are replicating the data and configuration to their other recovery environment. We're agentless. We just have you set up we give you a CloudFormation template to set up with RPO, which sets up some IAM roles and a Lambda that does all the work, and we're off to the races. So to put a fine point on it, so Choice Hotels is operating out of some region. It could be this region I'm pointing to here. It doesn't matter. Out of multiple accounts, and then in the recovery region, all of these artifacts are being created by RPO to recover in that region, so that in the case where something bad happens in that region, we push the button and they're back up and running across all their accounts, across all their workloads. And RPO understands 35 different AWS services, 115 different AWS resources. It's a bit of an eye chart, but take a look on here. If you're running something that's not on here, I'd love to hear about it. I would probably already know what it is our short list of future expansions, but we pretty much cover everything that most people are using. All right, let's talk about testing and getting beyond the tabletop. So BPO3 tests disaster recovery implementation to validate the implementation. And a lot of folks use tabletop exercises. And I love tabletop exercises. They're great. They're discussion-based. They focus on the processes, people, and collaboration, which is super important. You can't just focus on the tech. You have to focus on the people and the processes and the collaboration. But they're not actually running the tools, running the scripts. They're often what's called paper-driven exercises. Good stuff, but not sufficient. You got to do tabletop, and you actually have to do real, call it live fire exercises, right? And why do people not move off of the tabletop, right? Again, the tabletop's a good start, but you still got to do more. Why do people not do more? Because it's difficult to orchestrate. They're afraid of disrupting production, and they think it's going to take a lot of time, right? So let's talk about that. RPO has the big red launch recovery button, but it has the nice, pretty green, happy test button. With RPO, we want you to test. We want you to test more than once a year. We want you to test quarterly, maybe even monthly. And let me show you how we do that. Okay, this looks sort of familiar to before, right? This is the first slide I showed you. Set a complete copy of your source workload. The difference is there's no big red X, okay? When we're testing, we're standing up a complete recovery copy of your primary workload in your recovery environment, but there's no red X in the primary. You're still running out of the primary. Everything's happy there. And here's the RPO difference for testing. One, while you're in test mode, we're still taking backups, right? So if you actually hit the big red button and you're failed over, you're now, your master is the recovery environment. Customers are hitting the recovery environment. The data in the primary environment is no longer relevant. But when you're testing, you still want to take backups. You still want to maintain your ability to recover. So we continue taking backups in the primary environment. Network sandbox, or some folks call bubble testing. This is huge. Okay, this is the ability to put a firewall around that recovered environment because it's a test environment, so it can't talk to anything in production. This is to address that issue of people being afraid to disturb production. And this means you could test safely in the bubble without fearing affecting your production workloads. And teardown is just as easy. So easy to test. It stands up the entire workload. You end the test, it tears everything down in the recovery environment. Again, all without affecting production. So get off the tabletop, use RPO, test more often, give yourself the assurance. Now, ransomware recovery. I've been talking about disaster recovery, and I said, oh yeah, by the way, we also do this ransomware recovery thing. Just know that disaster recovery is one layer of protection. Ransomware recovery is not disaster recovery. It's a layer built on top of that. And ransomware is a big deal, right? So average ransomware attack results in 21 days of downtime, with 2/3 of organizations worldwide affected. Change Healthcare, I mean, back in 2024, massive ransomware attack. They're a healthcare provider intermediary. Even when they came back up, their clients, the healthcare clients, didn't want to connect to them. They didn't trust them. So you need a trustworthy way to recover from ransomware. And step one of that, I've talked about already, the clean room bunker with immutable backups, the ability to fail over, recover in a different AWS account with different credentials. That's step one. Step two is your data. RPO gives you the ability to pick a recovery point that's not the current one. Go back in time, pick your point in time recovery before the ransomware attack occurred, before your data was encrypted, before they demanded that Bitcoin, and restore that data, restore that safe, clean data. And the third way is to protect your compute. We protect your compute by putting it in quarantine. We use security groups to create a quarantine around every EC2 instance we bring up. And that way you could scan it with guard duty, you could scan it with third-party tools, and only when you're assured that it's clean, the green checkbox is there, you take it out of quarantine and you're back up and running. You might not have everything back up and running, but you're back up and running at some capacity. And this is how we get that 21-day recovery to under a day. All right, so working with RPO, time for the demo. All right, maybe what you were all waiting for. All right, so I'm going to switch what I'm sharing here. No, really, I am. How am I going to do that? All right, so let's stop sharing. I actually practiced this before the thing, and it still didn't. I still need more practice. All right, so share. Boom, boom. Okay, I am now sharing what I want to share. Okay, so this is the demo. And you get to see me fumble through that again when I go back to the slides. So this is RPO. All right, this is what the product looks like. And I'm actually going to start us out with just creating a new workload that I want to protect, right? So I'm onboarding to RPO. I'm going to create new, and I'm going to call this the webinar demo. And for my webinar demo, I get to pick what's my recovery point objective? What is my RPO? I can go up to 24 hours here. Why might I want to do that? It's less expensive, less data transfer costs, less data storage costs. It might be just the trick for my certain workloads. A lot of our customers like 1 hour or 15 minutes. That means, again, RPO is the maximum amount of data that you can afford to lose. We even have a real-time option. Real-time works with certain data sources, not all of them. It works with EC2, S3, DynamoDB, and Aurora. But I'm going to go with 1 hour for my demo. And now I got to give it a couple of pieces of information. I got to give it my source account. There's my source account there, and my source region, which I don't know. Is it showing the dropdown? I know that some webinar software doesn't show the dropdown, but I'm seeing a dropdown now showing every region in AWS commercial partition. So I'm going to pick US East 1. And now where do I want to recover this? Again, I can go same region, but I'm going to go cross region. I can go same account, but I'm going to go cross account. The US East 1 to US West 2 is very popular for US-based workloads. And so I have everything I need. I'm going to hit continue now. So what RPO is going to do is go out to that source account and source region I gave it and tell me, oh, here's everything in that account and region that I could possibly protect. And you can see there's a lot of checkboxes here, right? Network, it's storage, Kubernetes, compute. There's a lot of stuff here. I only want to protect the stuff in my workload. I don't want to protect every one of these resources. That's expensive and unnecessary. I have an ECS workload I'm running here, and I know that that ECS workload is using an ECS load balancer, right? So here's a target group. I could pick that. Or actually, I could have just picked the load balancer. I could pick the ECS load balancer, and look what happened. Everything else I need got selected. The target group, the internet gateway, the ACLs, the route tables, security groups, like all this stuff you wouldn't think about, right? When you're protecting a workload, transit gateway, VPC endpoints, and specifically the actual ECS service and clusters and repositories. All this stuff you wouldn't normally think about that you need, just one click of the button and RPO intelligently understands your workload. And I literally can then just come here and say finish. And RPO is now going to start backing up all that data, all of that infrastructure, and start protecting it. You see there's 50 resources here. So it's all the resources that live in this account and region. This is where I'm going to recover to. This is the primary account and region. This is my recovery environment. 50 resources got selected and 50 resources are going to be protected. Now I'm going to do the baking show trick because this will take about 15 minutes to back everything up and we don't want to wait that long. So I'm going to switch here and look, here's the same application I've already put into RPO. It's already been backed up and you can see all the green. And I want to show you some interesting parts of this. So for things that are free, to actually set up, we're going to set them up. Here's your VPC. Here's your transit gateway route table. Here's your subnets. They're all exist in the recovery side. So if I go to my recovery AWS account, these are already set up there. This is a pilot light strategy. We're only going to set up the minimum that we need until we actually click launch recovery. So what are we not setting up? Well, if you look at the RDS database, for instance, there's the RDS database and its replica. We have indeed backed up the data. The back data is here, but we haven't stood up a database here. Why is that? Standing up a database costs money. We're going to stand up the database only after we click launch recovery, and then the database will be stood up here. Similarly, the ECS cluster, the cluster itself is just a namespace, so we set that up. But the service, that's when we actually stand up Fargate tasks or EC2 instances. This happens to be Fargate. So we're not going to stand that up, again, until you click launch recovery. As I said, you have two buttons, test and launch recovery. Test gives you the ability to choose what applications you want to restore. You can restore multiple applications at a time, and it lets you choose the recovery point. If this is a regional issue, I'm going to pick the latest recovery point. If this is a ransomware attack, I'm going to dial back the time machine and pick a recovery point in the past. You choose your retention policies. You choose how many recovery points we retain. And then here's that network sandbox I was telling you about, right? So the ability to actually stand up a bubble around my workload as I stand it up so that it can't talk to anything except what I tell it to talk to. If I click the big red button, I also can pick my recovery point. I could also pick my applications, but now I have the ability to enable ransomware recovery and run guard duty on it. And you can see there's multiple applications you could define across your entire set of AWS accounts, and all of them are protected with Arpio. So with a click of a button, you could launch it and it's going to recover. So I don't think we have time to actually finish it, but I'm going to go ahead and do a test recovery, get that started. It's going to start recovering things, but it's going to take about 15 minutes. So I just, showing I could start that up and get that going. Maybe if we have time at the end here, I'll come back to it and show you what it did. All right, so now time to switch back to my slide deck. So let's do that. Okay, and so now we got to the point where I just want to brief reminder that this is recorded and will be sent out via email after presentation. And now is your time to really get those questions answered if I haven't answered them. And also call to action. Book a meeting with me. You want to talk about disaster recovery? You want to talk about RPO, how RPO can help you? Book a meeting with me. You want to talk about disaster recovery and not talk about RPO? Book a meeting with me. I love talking about disaster recovery, so I'm offering this as a free service to give you some expert, if I may say so, advice on disaster recovery for your product. All right, so spinning up new resources, Lambda, EC2, containers, networking in a different region account by infrastructure as code is one thing, but how do you ensure data parity replication for very large databases with minimal RPO? Not sure I understand the question, but okay, so we want to actually stand up a consistent recovery point. So when we back up, we're not actually using infrastructure as code. We're using Bodo 3 SDK to stand up the infrastructure based on our proprietary collection of the configuration and metadata about your infrastructure. That configuration and metadata about your infrastructure, which includes things like your Lambda function code, assuming you're not pulling it down from a container, right? If you have inline Lambda code, we'll actually back that up too. That plus the data backups are all done consistently as a single recovery point, immutable recovery point package. So it's going to be consistent with that point in time when you do recovery. So you literally, if you added a bunch of Lambdas at some time in your service, we'll back those up. But if you go recovery point before you did that, you won't see those Lambdas in the recovery point. So infrastructure is treated like data in that sense, and it's all done as a single consistent recovery point. And is IP address replicated from primary to DR environment? Private IP addresses inside of VPC are replicated unless you choose not to. We have some customers that have reasons why they don't want to do that. They want a different CIDR range, and they can configure that. By default, yes, you'll get the same IP addresses for the same resources privately. For public IP, like Elastic IP, we can't replicate an IP address. We will stand up those EIPs, those Elastic IPs ahead of time, though. So remember how I said we tend to stand up the stuff that's free? Well, there are some exceptions to that. we actually will stand up the elastic IPs, even though they're not free, ahead of time as part of your standby configuration so that you know exactly what those static IPs are. So when you do a failover, you have the automation in place to make use of those IP addresses. Any other questions? Out of curiosity, any plans to expand to Azure? We utilize both AWS and Azure. Yes, we are expanding to Azure. I can't give a strict timeline of that, but probably sometime next year. Other questions?
Seth, we have one from Henry. Henry asks, how do you cater for the next release after recovery when using infrastructure as code?
All right, so Arpio is not using infrastructure as code, so I can answer the question from an Arpio point of view, which is when you failed over, when you're recovering, we expect that to be a temporary situation. So you're operating there for hours or maybe even a day. And then assuming it's not a ransomware attack, you're going to fail back. And we do provide automated failback capability. So you shouldn't be releasing new functionality, new releases while you're in recovery. This is an all hands on deck emergency situation. We're trying to keep you running, and that's what we want to do. In the case of some customers, they might choose to continue running from that recovery environment, make that their primary. And we have a way to do that, in which case then you'd have to reestablish all your infrastructure as code and your pipelines there, and we could help with that. And then you would just do releases as normal. Next question is pricing. So let me switch screens back to the demo here. So as long as we're talking about pricing, everybody get a quick snapshot of that link to make a meeting with me. So you can make a meeting with me if you want to do that, because I'm about to take that away. And I'm going to switch back to the demo. Okay, so when you're looking at 50 resources here, right? And you can see, look, it's doing its processing. So it's failing, it's doing the recovery right now. When you look at 50 resources, things like IAM roles, internet gateways, network ACLs, all the little stuff that RPO worries about, so you don't have to, we don't charge you for those. What we do is we look at something called core resources. These are things that look like servers. So EC2 instances, S3 buckets, RDS tables, DynamoDB tables, EFS file systems, FSX file systems, OpenSearch domains. I might be missing a couple of them. Add those all up, and that's what we call a core resource. Doesn't matter how big or small they are. We just, each one counts as a core resource. Add up those number of core resources, and we'll come up with a yearly licensing fee for you. It's actually on our website if you want to see what the numbers look like. What if you already had another backup service protecting your critical databases? Do we need to replace it, or we could have both? You should have both if you want. Like some backup focused services do data, and they do data well. What they don't do is what RPO does, which is stand up a complete functioning workload. But in that vein, so like some backup services allow you to restore a single table or extract a single record from your backup, right? That's not RPO. That's not our thing. So if you need that capability, keep your backup service in place. If you don't need that, we are keeping immutable backups with recovery points and recovery point retention in a safe room environment. So if that is all you need from your backup provider, RPO does it all. If you need the extra bells and whistles of a backup provider, you might want to be using both. How do you stack up against other products such as Cutover and Commvault Cloud Rewind? Great question. Cutover, we're not a competitor. Matter of fact, you could probably, I don't know exactly what Cutover's integrations look like, but you could probably use us with Cutover. Cutover is a big graph of all the things you should do during recovery. Each node in that graph does a thing. File a ticket, stand up the database. RPO could be a node on that graph. Run RPO, recover with RPO. I love Cutover. The folks there are great. Some of them are ex-AWS folks I've worked with in the past. And if you're using Cutover, you should consider using RPO also. Cloud Rewind. That's the only one in the market that even comes close to trying to do what we do. We support 115 AWS resources. They support about 30. That's how we compare to Cloud Rewind. Any other questions? Any capabilities that support restoring on-prem servers to AWS temporarily? No, that's a good DRS use case. DRS is great for that. We do use DRS, but we use it for AWS to AWS. All right, keep them coming. Nope, no open questions. All right, maybe we're at the end. All right, just to briefly show you here what we got going on here. We're recovering We recover at the, I like to say we recover at the speed of AWS. So this will probably take 15 minutes total. So it's taking time to recover databases, it's not actually standing up the ECS service because it knows there are dependencies that have to be put in place before that. It's standing up the EFS file system. It's standing up the RDS instance. And in about, I don't know, it's been running for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, in about 5-10 minutes, it'll be done and we'll have a fully functional workload here. But, that 15-minute RTO, it's not bad. How do you integrate with AWS Resilience Hub? Great question. Again, Resilience Hub is a product I helped work on. So it's rules driven. I helped create the rules for it. And a lot of the stuff RPO is doing is native AWS best practices. So if you run with RPO, in theory, you run Resilience Hub, you'll get a good Resilience Hub score. That being said, I haven't tried it, and I've been meaning to. All right. With that, I think we've answered the last question. I'll give it, all right. I'll leave you with this rule of thumb about doing presentations. If you ask the audience any questions, and I've seen this so many times where someone says, all right, any questions? All right, moving on. Give your audience 5 seconds. Count it in your head. It'll seem like you're waiting forever. Give your audience 5 seconds. Now, I've given you more than 5 seconds during my little patter here, but we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That gives the shy people a chance to ask their questions. Sounds like nobody else has any questions. So I'll just thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. Hope you set up a meeting with me. All right, Alex, anything to send them off with?
No, just thank you, Seth. That was truly a masterclass. It's always so fun to hear you do your thing. I'm Alex. I'm the head of marketing at Arpio. Washington, our demand gen leader, is on the call as well, and you will hear from us. We will send out the deck, the recording. You'll get all these great resources Seth alluded to, or explicitly showed you. So we just really wanted to thank you for being here, and yeah, we are super excited to hear from you. So if anything comes up, you'll have our contact info and can get in touch.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.